This is amazing. It's like 7:04 in Missoula, and everybody's here. This never happens. And the sun is shining. That must be very much to the presenter and the topic, which we'll move to in just a moment. I'm Thurston Elstrom. I'm the Executive Director here at the Montana Natural History Center. If it is your first time here, thank you so much and welcome. We're glad you're here to join us for this wonderful topic and something that I am very passionate about. There's lots of squallows and memoras out right now. Maybe we'll hear some more about that. Okay. I would be remiss if I didn't take just a quick moment to thank our sponsor, the Good Food Store, for making the Hunting and Gathering lecture series possible. Please go hunt and gather everything good from the Good Food Store. Also, our libation sponsor, the Dram Shop, for providing some wonderful beer and wine. And I would encourage you, this is a series of lectures. Please check out our website. We have 3 more of these lectures coming up in the fall. And we also have other programming that might be of interest. So please look at montananaturalist.org. You can find out more. So, come on in, folks. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Diana Six, Professor of Entomology and Pathology at the University of Montana, Forest Entomology, I should say, in the Forestry and Conservation College, the W.A. Frank College. Diana has what I think might be about the coolest job on the planet. Her work on symbiosis, I don't even, like, there's so many words in your bio and CV that I don't even understand. But I know she gets to go to amazing and fabulous places like Africa, and Sweden, and Mexico, and the Flathead Lake Research Station, and Glacier Park. And I just have such admiration and respect for not only the work she does, but the fact that she's an amazing angler also. So without further ado, I'm going to stop ranting, and I'm going to turn it over to Diana.
This is a pretty amazing turnout, but it is Missoula, and Missoula likes fish, and I think they like insects. How many people here fly fish? Whoa. How many people don't fly fish but want to? All right, that's about everybody else. How many people like insects? That's awesome. Nice overlap there. And that's important, actually, because this talk is all about that overlap between fish and insects. Before I start, I have to give you a big caveat. And Thurston already kind of gave it away. I am not an aquatic entomologist. I'm a terrestrial entomologist. I do research on bark beetles, their fungi, trees, things on land. But I'm also an avid fly fisher. I tie my own flies. And as an entomologist, I really appreciate being able to put that all together, the knowledge of the insects and the fish, and how much more that gives me when I get out there on the water to help me understand what I'm seeing out there in nature. And so I'm going to try and impart some of that to you today. I'm going to give you some basics that should help you understand how to match the hatch, but not only that, understand some of the basic behavior of some of these insect groups so that you can know how to use those flies a little bit more effectively. And so I'm just going to take you through some of these steps. Now, let me get this thing going here. All right. I think I just turned it off. There we go. Okay. Now, you're probably aware that fly fishing is nothing new. It has actually arisen independently a number of times all over the globe, although probably the best known to us is fly fishing that has occurred in Japan and also in Europe. Many hundreds of years ago in Japan, tenkara arose, and it's a really elegant way to fly fish. It's a simple rod, it's a line, and a very simple but very effective little fly that mimics a whole number of insects. And like I said, it was developed a few hundred years ago. It's still used today. And it's become pretty popular in the U.S. over the last 10 years. I have a tenkara rod. It's really a cool way to fish, and it packs up so little. It's something you can take just about anywhere. Now, when you think about kind of the European traditions, most people think back to Isaac Walton, right? They wrote The Complete Angler. Some people even go so far to say is the father of fly fishing. If you've read The Complete Angler, you'll know that most of it he talks about shooting birds and rabbits and more about himself and fishing with bait. If you really want to go back to the origins, or at least the earliest known origins of fly fishing in Europe, you want to go back to Dame Juliana Berners about 200 years earlier. Now, she was a noblewoman, and she entered a convent and quickly rose to become abbess. And while she was abbess, she wrote a book, the first known book covering fly fishing. And in that book, she describes how to make the hooks, how to temper the steel, how to clean the wool, dye it with lichens and roots, how to match the particular flies with the right feathers for the wings. She has flies for each season and how to fish them, how to braid horsehair and dye it and make your own fly lines for each of the kind of light conditions. It's a pretty remarkable book, okay? So what this is really coming together to say is people have been fascinated for a long time with taking artificial materials like feathers and fur and now foam and just about everything and mimicking insects to try and catch fish. So this is something that we try to do when we choose flies out there on the water. But if you go out there and you look at the insects that are out there both in the air and under the water, it can become a little intimidating because there are so many types. And so people, you know, it's like wonder, how can I pick the right fly at the right time? How do you really decide which fly to choose? And so I think of this as kind of a three-step process. And the first step is when you get out to the water is resist that desire to tie on a fly and just start flogging the water, which we all do because we get excited and we want to fish, fish, fish right away. But what you should do is probably just sort of stand back and breathe and take time to observe what's happening. Okay, what's actually flying, what's on the water, what's going on. That's going to be your first step to be effective, is actually teach yourself to take time and become quite observant. The second step is use some information on actually the biology of these insects to be able to more efficiently use those flies. Okay, and I'll be going over some of this stuff. And then the third step, which is super important, is know how your flies look to a fish, not to a human. And there's a difference. So let's kind of step through these kind of suggestions that I've made. Let's say that you go out to a river and you encounter this. It's awesome. There are these gigantic mayflies that are hatching. They're all over. The fish are going nuts. They're sucking them up. And it's all one big thing. And that makes it pretty easy, right? You go in your box, you grab this big mayfly that looks like that, you tie it on, you flip it out there, and you hope you can compete with all this stuff. But you have a pretty good idea of what those fish are going for, okay? Something to know about fish is that they're very efficient foragers. They have to be, okay? So what they do is they cue in on whatever is most abundant and the easiest to get. So they're going to get the most return for their efforts. If a fish spends more calories and energy going after a bit of food than it gets back, it's not going to be around very long. So they have to be very good at this. So they cue in on what's abundant, what pays off in calories and nutrients, and then once that begins to subside, they'll switch to whatever becomes the easiest. Okay? So they will cue in on particular insects, and then as those become harder to get, they'll switch their image to another insect. Okay. So in this kind of situation, it's pretty easy. But more often, this is what we walk into, right? You walk out there and it's like, I don't see anything. Nothing's happening. Now what? There might be stuff happening. So this is where maybe you just want to step back and look closer. A lot of these are very small. You may not have much of a hatch happening, so there may not be very many out there. But take time to look around a little closer and make sure you're not missing something just because it's small. But then sometimes insects really are hard to find. They aren't very obvious. And in that case, you might want to take a different approach. One thing that's good is to walk along the banks and look in the vegetation. As I'll talk about in a moment, a lot of these insects, after they've emerged, they go off onto the vegetation. They hang out there for a while to mature. And so that'll let you know perhaps what might be coming off and mating in a couple hours and coming back to the water. But even there, maybe you aren't finding much. You may have to go underwater. So 70 to 80% or so is what's estimated of the part of the diet of a fish that they get from underwater, of the immature forms. So if you're not paying attention to what's under the water, you're missing a whole lot of what those fish are going after. So if you see this guy up in the corner there, he's got a net down in the water and is kind of scooping up the rocks. What he's doing is dislodging all those immature insects that are hiding down there and feeding, and they're going to drift down and get caught in the net. And then you can pick up the net, and even if you don't know your insect groups, you can see the size, the shape, the color of those nymphs, and it'll give you an idea of what you might want to throw out there. Okay? Not everybody wants to carry a big old clunky D-net around with them. What I do is I carry this little kick net, which I probably should have put together. It's shock corded and it's old, doesn't work so good anymore. But think of these as being stiff, and I had it all together. I put this down and I kick my feet around and the insects get caught in the net, and then they're kind of like that, and I can scoop it up and look at them, figure out what's out there, and then very quickly shake it out, bend it up, stick it back in my vest. So it's really easy to do this, and you can do it with these small nets, and you can get a lot of information. At the very least, you should reach down and grab stones and turn them over. Not only are you going to see a lot of what kind of nymphs are out there, but you'll have your eyes open to a really cool entire world that's underwater. There's a lot going on there we don't see if we don't take a closer look. Okay, so let's go through some of the major groups, and what I'm going to do is talk about who they are, a little bit about how to recognize them, a little bit about their life cycles and behavior, and then show you how to use that information to pick a fly and also to fish it. So I'm going to start off with the more, what we would call kind of more primitive insects. They're a lot more simple. And then I'm going to work my way up to the more complex ones. So our simplest group out there really are the stoneflies. And I'm going to start each one of these off with the female and her laying the eggs, and then go through the life cycle. So here we have a female. She's come down to the water after mating. She begins to drop eggs, sometimes singly or in a group. And they will settle to the bottom, and then they'll gradually hatch, and they'll come out as a nymph. And the nymphs come out super tiny, but then as they feed, they grow and go through various stages until they finally have consumed enough nutrients to basically build an adult body. And then using particular cues, typically temperature and day length, that will tell them what time of the season it is and when it's the appropriate time to emerge. For stoneflies, once they're mature as far as a nymph, they do not swim to the water. What they do is they typically crawl out on the bank sides, up onto rocks or right out of the water right here. You can see this one coming out of the water. Once they get out, they kind of attach, and then down the back of the exoskeleton, that kind of tough shell they have, they split, and out of that will come the adult that has the wings. They will then, once the wings have extended, they'll fly off to the vegetation. They stay there for a few hours or days to mature. Then they fly and find a mate, and then the female returns back to the water. And so you really have two main forms you're going to try and copy here with a fly. You have the nymph and you have the adult. So let's take a look at some of these. There's all sorts of sizes and colors of stonefly nymphs and adults. So you're going to have to try and match whatever's out there. Many of the nymphs are very dark colored, so you might pick a dark colored nymph to fish. Quite often they have a bead, which is brass or tungsten, to try and get it down on the bottom. For adults, oh, well, here's one over here. This is an almost mature salmon fly, the really awesome big one we have around here, and kind of a pattern that might mimic that. Here's the adults, and you're going to see kind of an orange body. This looks yellowish here, but they're really orange. And then here's another match to the adults. So you really have the adults and the nymphs that you want to copy. Now, let me back up a little bit here and talk about how you're going to fish these to match the behavior of the insect. If there's no hatch going on, pretty much your nymphs are going to be down here on the bottom feeding. These are not insects that typically drift. They don't like to be detached. They're going to be on the bottom. So when you're going to fish a nymph, you want it to be bouncing on the bottom. Fish are used to their food. And if their food behaves weird, different than it does in the river, they're going to get spooked. So you want your flies to behave as close to the natural as possible. And for these guys, it means it's going to be on the bottom, okay? Unless they're getting ready to emerge. That means they're heading out over here, okay? So if you're seeing some of these out here and these things coming out, that means some of these are probably on their way out. You might want to bounce your nymphs over here instead of down here. And then when you see the adults out, of course, you're going to get your dry in the water. Okay, let's go to mayflies. They're a little bit more complicated, okay? We're going to start with a female. They drop their eggs typically singly. Those, again, are going to finally get down to the bottom. They'll hatch. You have the nymphs feeding, going through the whole life cycle. But instead of crawling out onto the banks, these will swim to the surface. And as soon as they leave the bottom, they have left their safe spot. They are now super exposed to trout. They are in trout country once they're up here. So once they're trying to swim up, they're extremely vulnerable. And then these little tiny insects get up here, and they have a really tough job because they've got to break through that surface tension of the water. We don't even notice that because we're big and we're strong, but for something this little, getting through the surface tension of water is a lot of work. So they're going to have to struggle to get through that and finally get a bit up onto the surface. So when the back splits and the adult emerges, it won't be in the water because it's in the water, it gets stuck. Okay? So this is an extremely vulnerable period, the swimming, the breaking through the surface, and then finally getting up here to allow the split to occur, to allow the wing dun to come out. And trout know this. They love this, and they really focus in on these emerging mayflies. Once the emerger's up here, and again this dun kind of comes out, this is kind of a weird stage for an insect. It's the only insect group that does this. Any other insect, when you see them come out with wings, they're an adult, a sexual adult. Not so for these guys. These are sub-mature. They get their wings expanded, they fly off to the vegetation, and then up here they actually molt again, and out of that dun comes a new winged form called a spinner. So the dun has these dark wings. That's an easy way to recognize it. And all those dry flies you throw out there that look like mayflies, little sailboats on the water, those are mimicking this form. Once they get up here and they turn into a spinner, they have clear wings. The males are really crazy to look at. They have these gigantic eyes so they can find the females. And they have a little bit different color. And what they do is they mate, and then the female returns to the water. And then once she's dumped all of her eggs, she just basically collapses onto the water surface. And when she's there, you can see over here what we call a spent spinner. She's laying in the water surface with her wings out, kind of right in the film, and the tail out behind her. So it's a very, very different look to a fish than this. Okay? So let's look at what we match here. So if you've got your nymphs, these are some nymphs. You can grab little flies out of your box that are going to match kind of the size and shape and the color that you have in the water. It's a fairly easy thing to do. Then there's also, after the nymph, there's the emerger stage, these guys. And for that, we have fly patterns that mimic those. And these are super cool. Here's a really good pattern. There's lots of different types, but they're all designed to do the same thing. You have a part that sits on the surface in the air, and then a part that hangs under the surface in the water, which mimics that emerger as it splits and the subadult comes out. So this part, at least on this fly, is all tied with deer hair. It's very buoyant. It's hollow. This is meant to sit on the surface. This will be kind of sticking upward and give kind of a shadow impression of the dun's wings. This part, and you will gink this and you want it to ride really good and out of the water. This part is tied with very different materials. They're extremely absorbent. They suck up water. I don't know if you can see it, but it's got copper wire there to weight it and give it some reflectance. This part hangs down in the water. And it's a really great way to mimic the emergers. It's a pattern you guys should all have. Once this goes from an emerger to a dun, they're going to be kind of that sailboat look. They're going to have these dark wings. And these are some patterns that would then mimic that form. After that, when you move to the spinner, this is what they look like once they've laid their eggs and fall in the water. And so now, instead of the wings up, you're going to have wings to the side so that they're down on the surface. And you may not even want to get these you don't really want to gink these up much. You want them to sort of not ride high, but right kind of in the water. Okay? Even drifting under can be effective. Spinners are not as attractive to fish, I think because there's not much left of them. They're just an exoskeleton. But we have the trichos around here, the little tiny ones. Those are super good. For some reason, fish love those things even though they're super tiny. I guess because there's so many. Okay, so let me back up and talk a little bit about where to fish these. Obviously, with the nymphs, you're going to get them down here. You don't have to necessarily get them right on the bottom. Many of the mayfly nymphs like to drift, particularly in the morning and the evening. Some of these have a behavior where they just let go and they drift. And so they can be found in the water column. And so if they're submerged and just a bit off the bottom, that's not going to be a problem, and it might be more realistic for some of these. Okay? For the emergers, if you start seeing some of these duns on the water, sometimes you'll notice the fish aren't actually going after these, and you keep throwing them out, and they look perfect to you. It might be they haven't switched to going after those yet. They might be going for these. Okay? And so if you're just seeing kind of a start of a hatch, go for these first. You might be really surprised at how good those can work. And then, of course, when they get up on the water and they're duns, then you're going to use your typical upright wing patterns. And then when they're coming back to land, you can go for a spinner. All right, caddisflies. These are cool. These are more complicated than the ones I've been talking about. The ones I talked about before have something we call incomplete metamorphosis. And that means incomplete change. And you can just take this to mean they don't change very much. So if you take an immature and you look at an adult, they're going to look pretty much the same, except the adult's bigger, it might have some different colors, and it's got wings. But they're really going to look pretty similar. Like a stonefly nymph will look a lot like a stonefly adult, except the adult has wings. These guys are quite different. They have complete metamorphosis, which means they undergo a complete change from the immature to the adult. And in order to make a big change so that you actually are like almost a different organism, you need an intermediate stage where you can transform that body. So these guys have a pupal stage. And this is one of the, I think, more magical things out there in nature. In that pupal stage, the immature form basically goes into this quiescent stage, and inside that pupal skin, it basically dissolves. The tissues break down, the digestive system breaks down, the nervous system breaks down, and then they just rebuild into something else. Now, it's pretty amazing you can do that. I think it's amazing you can survive that. I wish I could do that, actually. This is really remarkable. But it means that the adult can look super different. Okay? Think about a caterpillar and a butterfly. If you didn't know better, and somebody came up and showed you a caterpillar and a butterfly and said they're the same organism, the same species, you'd go, yeah, right. Right? I mean, who would have thought? And that's what these guys do. Okay? So we're going to start with a female. They land on the water, drop their eggs. There's a few species that do something pretty cool. Instead of doing this, the females actually crawl down here, crawl around under here, and attach their eggs to the rocks. I don't know if we have these here, but we definitely have these, and this is the pattern. These are the patterns that we fish. So these drop down here, and then they hatch into larvae, and you guys can call them nymphs. But technically, with complete metamorphosis, they're called larvae. So I have to call them that because I'm an entomologist, but you can call them nymphs. Everybody else does. So these guys develop, and then once they're mature immatures, I'm not sure if I should say that, they form a pupal stage, and usually that means they're going to attach somewhere, go through those changes, and then when they're ready to emerge as an adult, the pupae, which have actually shed part of that pupal skin so that their antennae and legs are exposed, will begin to kind of pop up to the surface. Something interesting here is that that pupal skin, as they go through the transformation, it causes gas bubbles to form under that skin. And so when they release and they go to the surface, they pop to the surface really fast because of that bubble. They're not actually actively swimming much. Their legs are just kind of like this. Their antennae are coming behind them. But they pop right up to the surface very fast. And that accounts for some of the behavior you'll see with trout that are going after these. When they're going after mayflies that are emerging, they're coming up and they grab them. The trout just shoot right after them because they're moving fast, and sometimes that causes the fish to come out of the water a bit or maybe even all the way. It's because they're having to chase this thing down. So then when they get up here, they again have to get through the surface film. They get onto the surface, expand their wings, go up here, mature on the vegetation. Then they go out and find a mate, and then the whole thing repeats. So, see where I'm at on time. Okay, let's look at some of the flies, and I'm going to have to take you through a few slides here because there's a lot of different parts to this story. As far as the larvae, there's a couple of big groups. There are those that form cases, which are these protective structures they wear on their bodies, and those that don't. So these are the ones that don't. And this is a really common one. This is a great one for fish. They live in these little nets that they construct. Here's the head of one. And that net collects all sorts of particles. And then this will come out and pick off all the food and eat it, throw out the trash, and then hang out and wait. And then go get the food, throw out the trash, and repeat. But they don't stay in here all the time. They like to drift. And so in the morning or the evening, they might crawl out, drift downstream a ways, settle, build a new net, and feed there. And so they are available to trout. And trout like these a lot. And so here's a pattern that mimics this. You can see these gills. They're really wiggly in the water. And so this pattern mimics the shape, the color, and then the materials here are going to give some life to that when it's in the water. Okay? Here's another one that's really common here. This is the green rockworm. And this one doesn't like to drift. It hangs on tight. It's on the bottom. And so you're going to want beads on it to keep those things down on the bottom to be more lifelike. Something I'm going to start throwing in here at this part of the talk is the need to look at these flies the way fish are going to see them, not the way we look at them in our box or in the fly shop. And so if you see these here, these are wet, okay? And they're probably kind of fluffy before they got wet, but you can see that wet, they're going to look a bit more like a real larva. You can see how maybe this would look like something like this or like this. And in the water, these little fibers are going to be kind of swirling around. And so flies look very different when they're wet. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, so they're the ones that make cases as well. Okay, they make little structures for protection. They wear around. They make really cool ones. Some are snail-shaped. They're made out of all sorts of things. Here's a little, the legs and a head. This one's sort of got a log home. This one is chewed up little rings of the vegetation and put them together with silk to hold it together. This one has kind of a rectangular case. It gets bigger down here, and as it grows, it's going to get bigger as it adds on. This one's made of little pebbles, and people have figured out that if you have the right conditions in your terrarium, not terrarium, see I'm terrestrial, in your aquarium, you can actually raise some of these, and if you give them the right size substrate, they will make things that are very cool, like this gold, pearl, and opal case. You can get these on Etsy for earrings and things. I can't afford these, but there's other ones that like turquoise and stuff. And sometimes they cast little silver caddis that are in there. So anyway, the case builders are pretty cool. You can also fish these. You can get patterns that mimic the cases. Here's one that might look more like one that has a case made out of vegetation. This could mimic just about anything. You've got some hair up here by the head that's going to wiggle like legs. This one's pretty obvious. This one is tied what you would think almost like backwards. You've got this synthetic yarn with a match. You can burn the end, looks like a head, and then you wrap a dubbing case around it, a few feathers for legs. And then down here by the eye, you've got a bead. And that's an important placement because the case is the heaviest part of the insect. And so you want that to bob downward, not the head. Okay? One thing about cased caddis, I really love tying these flies, but I don't think they're that available to fish. They're not the best pattern, I think, patterns to use. I think the caseless ones, because they drift more, they're more available. These guys stay tucked down pretty tight. But you can fish them, you can catch fish, but I don't think they're as available. I think for fly tyers, they're just fun for us. All right, let's move on from the larvae and then talk a little bit about the emergers. These are the pupae. These are pretty amazing patterns. Here's kind of what a pupa might look like. This one's a little more colorful than many. But you have the head, you have these long, beautiful antennae, these legs that kind of hang, these darkened wings, and then usually some segments. And so if you look up here, I think you can see how that could mimic that pretty well. You've got segments, you've got the legs, the antennae, the wings. Here's one that's pretty cool. In all that fuzzy stuff, that actually captures bubbles, and so that kind of gives that look of the bubble that might accompany them. You can see how these, when they're wet, might be really nice. This looks super fluffy, but when you get it wet, it changes completely on what it looks like, and it has nice movement. I love this fly up here. It's wet, and you can kind of see how it might look to a fish. Okay, now the adults. Okay, they actually look like little moths or medium moths, depending on which one. Here's an October caddis. Here's some others. But you can tell them apart from moths pretty easy if you can get your hands on them. When you get a moth, you know how you get all that silver or powdery stuff all over your hands? Those are scales that are on the wings. That's what gives that beautiful pattern that they have. If you get these, they don't have any scales at all. They kind of have smooth wings with a few hairs. And one of the real dead giveaways is these long antennae. You're not going to find antennae like that on a moth. Okay? These are some patterns. This is one that'll just give a nice silhouette on the water. This one has these beautiful wings and some buoyant deer hair or elk hair up here. And then there's this one that looks kind of messy, crappy. It's not a really pretty bug. This is awesome. This is, if you guys fish, you know what this is. It's an elk hair caddis. It's one of the best, I think, caddis patterns out there. I like to have a lot of different colors and sizes, but it's also messy enough that I think that it can mimic a lot of other insects. So you can actually use this like a lot for a lot of things. So it's just a really good pattern. So let me go back. Oops, I'm going the wrong way, giving away the story. Go back here and talk a little bit how to fish these things. So of course with the dries, you're going to get them out on the water. With the larvae, for the cased ones, you're going to try and be on the bottom. With the other ones, have them slightly up in the water column is okay because they do drift. The pupae, you can fish a couple of different ways. I tie them sometimes unweighted. I get them nice and wet. I throw them out there and they just sort of hang below the surface. But you can also weight them, throw them out there, get them down. And then as you let things cast and your line begins to drag and pull up, it will pull them up much like a natural emergence. And that's where a lot of times they'll take these. And there's a number of other ways to fish them, but you try to get them to look either floating in the surface or kind of coming up. Okay, let's go to our last group of aquatic insects. These are the midges. They're really tiny, tiny little advanced flies, some of the most advanced of our insects. They land on the water. They're very light. They lay eggs in these little rafts usually. Sometimes those egg rafts float, and then the larvae hatch out and drop through the water, or they can sink. The larvae end up typically down in these little tubes in the sediment and the silt or in algal layers, and a lot of times they're just not that available to fish. Okay? But when they become pupae, again they have to enter the trout's world. They have to leave their kind of protected areas and they have to get up to the surface. Some of these have kind of like what looks like a humpback without any gills. Some have these little gills on the top. But in any case, they have to get up here. They have to break through the surface film, go through all that stuff the other ones do. And of course, that makes them very vulnerable. And then when they come back to lay eggs, again, they're vulnerable to fish. So let's take a look at some of the patterns. Some people swear by fishing the little tiny larvae. I never do. I haven't had much luck with them, but I think in certain situations they're probably fine. This is what they look like. They're often C-shaped, got this little fake leg. They're all different colors. They can be tan, they can be brown, they can be green. If you see a lot of red ones where you're at, that's not good because those only exist where there's almost no oxygen, which means you're not going to have any trout. But you can still use red ones. The color is really weird with this projector.
I don't think your projector's plugged in all the way because you're
yeah, because all the colors are missing on these. I can't see from here, but
can we jiggle your plug?
I don't know where it is, but
Something going on.
yeah. But anyway, just don't lose my last slides, Christy. Ah. Uh-oh. It's back. No color. I would leave it alone, though. Just in case. All right. So there's a red one up here. Fish, for some reason, like red, even if it's not like a normal thing in their habitat. So it doesn't mean it's not a good thing to use. Here's a real pupa with that kind of gill up on top. And over here is this really nicely tied pupa. You can see how little these things are. Midges are small. Here's one that doesn't have any of those. Here's an adult. You can see how delicate they are. And so when they're sitting on the water, they're not making much of an imprint. Okay? Here's a fly that you might use to mimic a midge. You've got this hackle here. This is what's going to be sitting on the water. If you're trying to do an individual midge, you want very minimal hackle. But if you have a lot of hackle, that's not a bad thing. Sometimes we really hackle these up because there's this behavior, well, it's not a behavior, I think it's just something that happens to them. But when midges emerge, there's usually a bunch, and they will kind of drift together on the surface and form these clusters. And so these more heavily hackled ones kind of mimic those midge clusters. And for people like me, those bigger flies you can actually maybe see, and you can add these things that help you as well. That's not for the fish, that's for us. Okay. Yeah. Probably. I used to tie those. I can't even see them anymore. Yeah, you have to split your thread. You get thin thread and then you split it. Because more than a few wraps and all of a sudden it's like big and fat, and you don't want that. No, it's crazy. Little tiny things. Getting your tippet through that is crazy. Yeah. Okay, so that's your aquatic ones, but that doesn't mean that's all you get. There are terrestrials, and everybody should consider these. These are ones that live on land. They don't want to be in the water, because being in the water means two things. One of two things, or both. You're going to drown, or you're going to get eaten by a fish. Or you're going to drown and get eaten by a fish. Most of us know about hoppers. You know, in July, they're all over the place. You throw them out there. It's like throwing T-bone steaks out. Fish love them. You don't have to cast delicately. In fact, that's the last thing you want to do. It's great for me. But there's all these other ones, bees, beetles, ants. Oh my God, beetles must be really good. They're on there twice. Oops. And they are. And moths even. So let me show a couple types of patterns there. Ants are great. If you're on small creeks or streams, lakes, high country lakes, you should always have ants. And there are red ants in there. Red ants, red and black ants, no, you can't do that, Christy. Ants with wings. They're really good to have, okay? Other things, of course, the hoppers, are wonderful, tons of patterns. Beetles, brown beetles, green beetles, yellow beetles, black beetles, they're wonderful. They mimic a number of things. Something a lot of people don't do. I know almost no one that fishes bees and wasps. I started tying them because I like to make bugs. And then I throw them out to see if they work. And I have caught more fish on some trips on the West Fork and Fish Creek and stuff on these than anything else. It makes sense in a way, I guess, if you have a lot of wasps and things flying in the summer, or maybe they just like the bright colors or it's attractive, but I would not ignore these, okay? And this one down here is kind of specific or special, not specific, but special maybe in Montana. This is a spruce moth. We have an insect here called the spruce budworm. It's a moth. Here it doesn't like spruce as much. It loves Doug fir. And it builds up these big outbreaks. We're just coming out of an outbreak. If you go over Rogers Pass, you go to the Big Hole, you go to Yellowstone, Deer Lodge Valley, big outbreaks, lots of trees that got defoliated, a bunch that got killed. When these guys were flying during the outbreak, they're day-flying moths, at my sites for beetles out on the Big Hole, They would be hanging off my eyebrows, my eyelids. They were like, you couldn't breathe. They were so abundant. It was just like snow. And they were falling in the big hole. And of course, the fish were like, cool. And you talk to the guides down there, they all have their own spruce moth patterns. And every time this thing outbreaks, about every 10 years, they pull these things out, and they're killer. Last year I went down there and Divide, and I talked to him. I said, so you're still using spruce moth? They go, oh yeah. Even though they've kind of crashed out, the fish are still going after them. So even moths make a good pattern. These things are just floppy things on the water, really easy to tie. Okay, so how do you know, though, what the fish are eating? If you read all these nice fishing books from England, all the really proper ways to fly fish, you're going to go out there and take a little spoon and scoop out their bellies, the fish, and look to see. I don't really want to do that to a fish. It doesn't seem very nice. I'm not sure how well they survive the whole process. Biologists use stomach pumps. But I think for us, being really observant, looking in the air, under the water, learning about nature in the process might be one of the best ways. You're going to learn about the insects and appreciate, I think, just this kind of ecosystem that you're out as part of it. And look to see how the fish are feeding. That's going to help you. Are they kind of jumping out of the water? Are they sipping? Are they not coming up at all? All of that's helpful. So how do you match the hatch? Well, size matters, and a lot. Okay? You really need to get a pretty good match, because if the fish are selective and they're going after a particular thing, if the size is off, they're not going to be as responsive to your fly. Some words of wisdom I picked up from a lot of people and guides over the years is that you should be looking for perhaps what's most abundant. Okay? What's most mature, that's going to be bigger and closer to hatching, and most available. Okay? There might be something that's very abundant, but if it's not a form that's really available, it's not going to matter that much. Okay? So those are things to keep in mind. Sometimes we have no idea. Too often, I think, we have no idea what really to use. There's searching patterns that you can use that just seem to be attractive to fish, and those are things you can switch to, you know, when you're really not sure. Change it up. Change your flies. If it's not working, don't slog that thing all day. I think we're all resistant to that. It's sort of like, kind of when you're playing a slot machine, and you're like, you've been playing it for an hour, and you want to quit, but it's probably that next one, you know? You know, I've been doing it this long, what are the odds? It's going to be the next one, you can't quit. And it's the same thing with a fly, but I think you have the same, it's the same outcome, right? You stick with the slots, you're still not going to get it. You stick with a bad fly, you're still not going to get the fish. So trade it up. You know, give it up if it doesn't work, keep switching. Up your odds. A lot of people like to fish dry dropper systems. So you have a dry fly you think's matching what's out there, and then hang a nymph off the end. Okay? You got a double shot there. And ask the local fly shop. These people really know their stuff. They're gonna, if you're picking out flies, they can tell you actually what it is. You know, that's a mayfly, that's a whatever. They can tell you if it's what's hatching or what's good on their creek. And these people don't make a lot of money. They're usually on the edge. So if you're going to go in and get a lot of information, buy some flies, make it a win-win. They're really good. Okay, now it brings me to one thing, or not one thing, a few things. So this is what you should probably do when you want to try and see like a fish, because we want to see the flies the way the fish sees it, not the way we do. So look out on the water. Let's say you see something out there that looks like, oh, it's kind of tan, it's about this size, it acts like a mayfly. So you grab your fly and you look at it. Is it the right size? Yeah. Shape? Yeah. Color? Yeah. Put it back in your box. And then go 2 sizes down. Invariably, when we look at flies that are out on the water and what we match, it's too big. Okay? If you don't believe me, next time you see a little insect out on the water, match it, throw your fly out next to it, And I bet yours is going to look like a mountain next to a molehill. Okay. So we do tend to see things too big. It might be the way the sun reflects on flying insects or whatever. But getting that size can be easier if you try to go smaller. And then put it in a fishy situation. So you're going to grab, let's say you got a dun. Grab this thing. Look at it. Oh, it's so pretty. It's got this beautiful little back, and it's got the wings. And you're looking at the top of the fly usually, right? How often do you think a fish is going to see the top of your dry fly? Well, if you cast like me, probably more often than you want. But if you get it to land the way you want it, they're not looking at the top of the fly. They're looking at the bottom. So turn it over and look at the bottom. Okay? And I'll show you some tricks in a minute for that. If you have a nymph, a wet fly, get it wet. Okay? You'll be shocked at the color changes sometimes, the way it looks, the size, especially with natural materials, things that you've matched the color. As soon as it gets wet, it's something else. So get an idea of what your flies look like wet. All right? So now it brings me to this part of the lecture. You know I'm a professor, right? So you knew this was coming, that you were going to have to take a test, right? But lucky for you, you guys are not being tested. We're going to test some flies. Okay? So what I'm going to do is, after we stop and I answer some questions and so forth, is I have some stuff up here where you can test flies. And I've got 2 minutes, I think, to show you real quick. I have this high-tech method. It's called a stemless wine glass. And you put water in it, and you put your dry fly in here, and you look at it. What does it look like? Does it look like a big cotton ball? It's over-hackled, and the fish are going to think it's a cotton ball, and it's not little feet, delicate feet. You know, over-hackle's great on a fast river where they don't have time to take a look. But otherwise, they're going to see it. What do the wings look like? Do they look like opaque, dark things up there, or they look like wings? And you can put light conditions. You can put your phone light over it, or you can go over and look in dark conditions in the shadows and see what it looks like under cloudy or sunny conditions. Super easy. One more thing, because I think this is my cue that I better shut up. You can get one of these like fancy high-tech cup holders, put a petri dish in it, and a makeup mirror, which I don't even know how to open, and you can put it in here like this, put your fly in there, and then you just look at that and you can see what it looks like. And you can again have low light conditions or put your light over the top and look at high light conditions. So there's ways to do that, and later on I'll show you how to do the larvae as well. I also have some books up here I can show people that are not the everyday fishing books. What they do is they link the insect biology to the fly, to the behavior, in order to fish better. And they're really wonderful books. So I have no financial interest. They're just great books, and I can turn you on to those. And with that, I'll, I believe, take some questions. Boom. Thanks. All right. So I've got 2 people here. We'll start with you.
Could you give some example of searching patterns?
I was afraid of that one. No, I like to use L. caricatus. There's like these, I'm trying to think. You know, Stacy, you should save my butt here. Stimulators, that's the one I was trying to think of. So there's a number of those, like, kind of general dry flies that are really good. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, you're next.
Okay, on the caddis flies that they eat, when they hit the case ones you were talking about, do fish eat those much?
They do. If they can get to them, and they eat case and all. Yeah, and then they just poop out the sand and stuff.
And then also, caddis, it seems to be that when you skitter a fly, that turns me.
Yeah.
What part of that life cycle?
That would be the females that are laying the eggs, because they actually do kind of skitter across the surface. I think it's a way to keep...
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at the end of your swing, you know, just got to
Yep.
like
Yeah, so that would be on your dry flies, and that would mimic the female. Yep.
The great searching pattern, I think, is the royal wolf, because
Yeah.
it'll imitate both the mayfly family and the caddis family.
Yeah.
And it's wildly popular.
Yeah, that's a really good one. That's one of my favorites. Yeah. Royal Coachman. And the royal wolf if it's fast water. Yeah.
Did you know? Oh, I was going to say the parachute Adams was purple haze.
Yep. So what color is a purple haze when it gets wet?
Well.
With the gink?
I know, I don't really use gink. I just, mostly chuck them in there and blow them off when I need to. But I don't know. I think it's still purple, but I mean,
It's just dark purple.
just dark and muddy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What is the survival of the climate in water?
Oh, I don't know, but a lot of them don't make it. So fish are going to eat a lot. So that's why insects have so many kids, right? I mean, they produce hundreds per pair, and that's because only so many are going to make it. They're going to not make it as nymphs. A lot of them are going to lose it, just going up as an emerger. But that whole process of molting and shedding the exoskeleton, there's a bunch that get trapped in those. And there's actually really cool patterns you can tie to look like trapped ones. And so insects have huge mortality rates. Something a lot of people don't realize, a lot of the insects that die, a lot of the males never return to the water. They actually end up out on land. And this is hard to believe for such little insects, but there's so many of them over time. They add to the nutrient subsidies for terrestrial systems. So the nitrogen, a lot of things go up immensely around lakes and riparian areas just from the insects that are not making it back to the water. So.
What about dragonflies and damselflies?
Still water, I'm lost.
So they're mostly still water?
They're still water. There's a few damselflies that are in moving water, but they're in the real sluggish stuff, the places where you're really not going to find the kind of stuff in Montana we're usually after, like trout. But in lakes, they're great, but I've just never learned those as far as the fishing part very well. Yeah.
Diana, what about little lobsters?
I don't know anything about those either. We don't. I know. We don't really have much around here. In the east, Costa Rica. I mean, God. What are about Megaloptera, which are Dobson flies? They're really amazing. And if you get the adults, like the big ones, the females will take your fingers off. They have jaws like crazy. But they're not like a major component. I'm not even sure they're right around here. But you go east, they're pretty common. And they're great patterns because they're big. Yeah. Do you fish those? You're just giving me a hard time. I know him. Yeah. Yeah.
Once or twice on the sea, find these ones that are very small boats.
The yellowish ones with the long tails? Yeah. I got some of those off of Flathead when I was up there. And I have no idea what they are. They're in my freezer right now. My poor partner has to put up a... What were these great big yellow mayflies, kind of really big? I mean, they're big, and they've got long tails. The ones we have in the freezer? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the stillwater stuff at all, really. But they're pretty amazing. I had no idea we had such big ones here. They have some in Hungary that are like that.
Wow.
Yeah, and purple. You'd love that.
Once we were in Ireland, and they fish there for, what do you call it, standing long legs, use spiders.
Spiders.
And they're so delicate, you can't cast them,
Yeah.
So the guy got the boat sideways to begin, and he just drifted it, and just
Yeah.
drifted it with a super long rod.
spiders are amazing. And they fish well here.
Oh, have you tried it?
Yes.
That'd be with-
I tie spiders a lot. And if you use less delicate material, like you use the really long pheasant tail, like towards the base of the feather, and put that little knee in there with the knot, and you throw those out there, it's just like, bam. And they work really good on the few lakes I fish too, like in the Beartooths and stuff. I think because they're just so, they're so lifelike. Yeah, they're really amazing. And you can add little wings and stuff and a little more hackle, and then they really, and make them smaller, and it's a magic fly. Yeah. Yeah. So spiders are these really cool English patterns that we don't fish here, and we should. So if you get online and search under that, they're pretty awesome.
What about mice?
Mice. I wish. Yes. So I have tied mice for people that wanted to go fishing in Alaska and so forth, but I guess for some of the bigger fish, taimen and all, you can use mice. I haven't done it. You have probably. No?
I was always open to suggestions.
Yeah. No, really big fish will eat rodents, everything that falls in, and some places mouse patterns are really hot, but I've never had the pleasure of fishing those kinds of sizes of fish. I fish for tigerfish in Africa. Now that's an experience. You tie these great big flies with gapes like that, what look like wounded fish, and then, you know, just like buckle down and hang on to the boat, because when they hit, it's just like train. You know, it's like, you know, yeah, that was pretty cool. And then you get them and you don't know how to get them off the hook because their teeth are that long. So, but any other questions? Yeah, huh?
I remember just one of the biggest breakthroughs for me with fly fishing was when I walked up to a stream and it was looking at the stream and finally understanding from the topography, the underwater topography of the water, that maybe this is where the stoneflies would be, or in the quiet water, this would be where the certain kind of mayflies would be.
Right.
And do you have any additional knowledge that you can share as far as for people that, you know, when they're doing that?
Yeah, typically the most productive part of a stream is a riffle. That's where you're going to find the most insects. That's where a lot of your stoneflies are going to be because they have a high oxygen requirement. But then, you know, there are shallower areas, slower areas. They're going to have, like you said, some mayflies and stuff. They don't tend to be as productive as far as insects. But you will have cased caddis, you can have mayflies there. But in part the reason that riffles are so good is because that's where a lot of food is. Or the foam lines, because that's where they're being concentrated, the stuff on the surface. But it doesn't mean you have to ignore the other areas. They're just there's less there, and often it's smaller, it's different stuff. And that's another reason to just sort of spend some time out there walking around with a net and looking and getting a feel, because it's going to change a lot from place to place. These insects are super sensitive. They have really precise requirements. And so in one part of the stream might be a lot of oxygen and this and that. Maybe the food is moving in correctly for them to capture. Another area, if you're a net builder, you can't be in really fast flowing water. It'll rip your nets apart, so they're going to be off a bit. So each of those insects has a really specific need, and that's going to determine where it's at. And in the class I teach on campus, we actually use those to assess condition of streams. If we find sensitive species in particular streams, we know that the oxygen content is high, the pollutants are really low. If other ones show up, then, ooh, it might be compromised because these can tolerate those conditions. So they're super sensitive, and it changes even just in a few inches sometimes.
So they migrate? So
Some do.
bugs migrate?
Some do when they can. So if like, you know, when we start getting low flows and stuff, and it starts getting hot, oxygen is lower, a lot will release and drift trying to get somewhere else. Some will crawl to try and get to cooler, more oxygenated waters. You know, they're limited to a degree to how far they can move, but they do migrate and move around as conditions sort of shift. Yeah.
So I think we're at the end of the
Okay.
whole part of our program, but you have some show and tell there.
Yeah, so in the announcement I said if anybody wants to bring their favorite fly and we can test it, that's great. They didn't expect quite this many people, so if everybody brought a fly, we're in trouble. But if you have a fly, we can test it. I have some flies up here. I can show you how to do this high-tech glass thing, and also some nymphs. You can take a look at some of the books. And I have a few bugs pickled in alcohol if you just want to take a look at some bugs. So.
Well, thank you all for coming. And
Yeah. Thank you.